The morning my father died, my brother Marcus called me exactly once. Not to grieve together, not to plan the funeral, but to inform me that he would be taking over Harrison Manufacturing as the rightful heir. His exact words still echo in my mind like a slap across the face. Listen, Sophie, I know Dad always had a soft spot for you, but let's be realistic here. You're a teacher, for crying out loud. I've got the MBA, the business experience. This company needs a man who understands industry, not someone who spends her days with finger paints and story time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I stood in my small apartment kitchen, still in my pajamas, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while listening to his patronizing tone. Through my window, I could see the morning sun casting long shadows across the city, and somewhere in that sprawling urban landscape sat the building that housed Harrison Manufacturing, the family business my father had built from nothing over 30 years ago. What Marcus didn't know, what nobody in my family knew, was that I owned that building, not the business inside it, but the very foundation it stood upon. My name is Sophie Harrison, and at 28, I had spent the last 6 years teaching 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary while quietly building a real estate empire that would make my business school graduate brother's head spin. But that morning, listening to Marcus dismiss me as if I were still the little girl who used to follow him around asking to play with his toys, I realized that some secrets have perfect timing. And this particular secret was about to change everything. The story really begins 3 years earlier, when I made what everyone in my family considered the most impractical decision of my life. Fresh out of my master's program in education, with student loans hanging over my head and a modest teaching salary awaiting me, I used every penny of my inheritance from my grandmother to purchase a rundown building in the industrial district. My parents thought I'd lost my mind. Marcus laughed outright, suggesting I stick to what I knew best, which, according to him, was crayons and craft time. What none of them understood was that I'd been studying the area for months. The city had approved a massive urban renewal project, and property values in that district were about to skyrocket. While my family saw a crumbling warehouse in a questionable neighborhood, I saw opportunity. The building had good bones, and more importantly, it sat on a corner lot, with excellent access to the main thoroughfares. Perfect for manufacturing or distribution. I spent my first summer vacation not relaxing on a beach somewhere, but learning everything I could about property management, tenant relations, and commercial real estate. I painted walls, fixed plumbing, and negotiated with contractors, all while my family assumed I was just playing around with my little project. When the building was ready, I started looking for the perfect tenant, someone who needed space for light manufacturing or assembly work. That's when my father approached me. Harrison Manufacturing had been leasing space across town for years, but their current landlord was raising the rent substantially, and Dad was looking for alternatives. He'd driven past my building during one of his property scouting trips and was impressed by the renovation work. He had no idea his youngest daughter owned it. To him, I was just the teacher in the family, the one who'd chosen children over commerce. Through my property management company, Mitchell Holdings, a name I'd chosen specifically because it bore no resemblance to Harrison, I negotiated a lease agreement with my own father. The irony was almost too perfect to bear. Every month, Harrison Manufacturing sent rent checks to Mitchell Holdings, and every month I deposited them into accounts my family knew nothing about. My father often complained about his mysterious landlord, a faceless corporation that demanded prompt payment but seemed impossible to reach for building improvements. What he didn't know was that I was always listening. Every time he mentioned a maintenance issue, I had it fixed within days. When he needed additional electrical capacity for new equipment, I had electricians there the next week. When the loading dock needed repairs, I handled it immediately. My father began praising his responsive landlord to anyone who would listen, never suspecting that his reliable property manager was his own daughter, the one he still thought of as his little girl who played with dolls. Meanwhile, my day job as a third-grade teacher provided the perfect cover. Everyone, including my family, assumed that my modest teacher's salary was my only income. They had no idea that the building's rent, combined with strategic investments I'd made with the profits, had grown into a substantial portfolio. While my colleagues spent their summers traveling or relaxing, I spent mine acquiring additional properties, always through Mitchell Holdings, always keeping my growing real estate empire completely separate from my identity as Sophie Harrison, elementary school teacher. My father had built Harrison Manufacturing into a solid, profitable business. He specialized in custom metal fabrication, serving clients throughout the region who needed everything from architectural elements to industrial components. The work was steady, the client relationship strong, and the business had supported our family comfortably throughout my childhood. But as Dad aged, the physical demands of the work began taking their toll, and he started talking more frequently about succession planning. Marcus, 5 years older than me and armed with his MBA from a prestigious program, had always assumed he would inherit the business. He'd joined the company straight out of business school, taking on increasingly important roles in operations and client relations. To his credit, Marcus was good at the business side of things. He understood profit margins, supply chain management, and customer relationship dynamics. What he lacked was Dad's intuitive understanding of the craft itself, the artistic eye that made Harrison Manufacturing special. Dad never explicitly promised the business to anyone, but family dinners often included discussions about the future, with Marcus confidently outlining his plans for expansion and modernization. I listened to these conversations with interest but never inserted myself into the succession discussions. After all, I had my own career, my own path. Or so everyone believed. The truth was more complicated. Despite my love for teaching, I'd inherited more of my father's business instincts than anyone realized. My real estate investments weren't just lucky breaks. They were the result of careful market analysis, strategic planning, and calculated risk-taking. The same skills that made Dad successful in manufacturing made me successful in property development. But in my family's eyes, I was still the daughter who'd chosen the safe, traditionally feminine career path. Our family dynamics had always been traditional in the most frustrating ways. Dad loved me dearly, but he'd grown up in a generation where men handled business and women handled everything else. He'd supported my education enthusiastically, proud that his daughter was smart and capable, but he'd never seriously considered that I might want or be suited for the business world. When I chose teaching, he'd been relieved. It was a respectable profession for a woman, one that would allow me to have a family someday without the pressures of running a company. Marcus had absorbed these same attitudes, perhaps even more rigidly than our father. To him, my teaching career confirmed that I lacked the competitive drive necessary for business success. He saw my kindness with my students as evidence that I was too soft for the hard decisions business required. When I asked thoughtful questions about the company during family discussions, he attributed my curiosity to daughterly interest, rather than genuine business acumen. The irony wasn't lost on me that while Marcus climbed the corporate ladder within Harrison Manufacturing, I was quietly becoming one of the more successful commercial property owners in the city. My portfolio had grown to include not just Dad's building but 3 other properties strategically located throughout the industrial corridor. The urban renewal project I'd anticipated had indeed transformed the area, and property values had increased by over 200% in 3 years. But I maintained my dual existence carefully. At school, I was Miss Harrison, the devoted teacher who arrived early and stayed late, who spent her own money on classroom supplies and worried about each student's progress. At home, I was Sophie, the daughter who brought homemade cookies to family dinners and listened patiently to Marcus's business lectures. Only in the privacy of my own apartment, reviewing financial statements and property reports, did I allow myself to acknowledge the magnitude of what I'd built. My father's health began declining noticeably last year. Nothing dramatic, just the accumulated wear of decades in a physical industry. His hands, once steady enough for the most delicate welding work, developed a slight tremor. His back, strained from years of lifting and bending, required frequent rest breaks. He started delegating more responsibilities to Marcus, who accepted each new duty as confirmation of his eventual inheritance. Dad never spoke directly about his plans for the business, but the assumption was clear to everyone. Marcus was the son, the MBA, the one who dedicated his career to Harrison Manufacturing. I was the daughter, the teacher, the one who'd chosen a different path. The traditional logic was so ingrained that questioning it seemed almost absurd. What none of them knew was that I'd been quietly preparing for this moment for years, not because I coveted the business itself, but because I understood something fundamental about power and respect that my family had never grasped. Money talks, but ownership shouts, and I owned the ground they stood on. The building lease between Harrison Manufacturing and Mitchell Holdings was structured as a long-term agreement with reasonable rent increases built in over time. My father had been thrilled to secure what he considered an excellent deal, and he'd often bragged to Marcus about his negotiating skills in landing such favorable terms. Marcus, in turn, had praised Dad's business savvy, never suspecting that the generous lease terms were possible only because the landlord had interests beyond maximum profit. I'd used the steady rental income from Dad's business to expand my real estate holdings strategically. Each acquisition was carefully planned, each property selected for its potential rather than its current condition. My portfolio included a former textile factory that I'd converted into artist studios, a small office building that housed several successful startups, and a retail space in an up-and-coming neighborhood that commanded premium rents from boutique tenants. Mitchell Holdings had become a significant player in the local commercial real estate market, though the company's actual owner remained a mystery to most people, including my family. I'd cultivated this anonymity carefully, working through lawyers and property managers who handled the public-facing aspects of the business. To anyone who might investigate, Mitchell Holdings appeared to be owned by a private investment group with no obvious local connections. My teaching colleagues often joked about my modest lifestyle, assuming that my teacher's salary required careful budgeting. They weren't wrong exactly. I did live modestly, but not because I had to. The small apartment, the practical car, the simple wardrobe were all choices that supported my dual existence. Drawing attention to unexpected wealth would have raised questions I wasn't ready to answer. The questions weren't just about privacy, they were about timing.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
But I simply nodded, playing the role of the grieving daughter who deferred to her brother's superior business judgment. The funeral itself was a testament to my father's impact on the community. Harrison Manufacturing's clients attended, along with suppliers, employees, and competitors who'd respected Dad's integrity and craftsmanship. Speaker after speaker praised his dedication, his fair dealing, his commitment to quality work. Listening to these tributes, I felt a deep pride in what he'd built, and a growing determination that his legacy wouldn't be diminished by anyone's narrow assumptions about who could or should continue his work. After the service, during the reception at our family home, I overheard Marcus talking to several of Dad's business associates. He was already positioning himself as the natural successor, outlining his vision for the company's future with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted his right to inheritance. When one of the older clients asked about the transition plan, Marcus gestured toward me and said, "Sophie's got her own career, of course. Teaching is really where her heart is. She'll be involved in family decisions, but the day-to-day business operations will be my responsibility." The casual dismissal stung, but it also crystallized something I'd been feeling throughout the grieving process. This wasn't just about business succession. It was about recognition, respect, and the right to be taken seriously. Marcus saw me as his little sister, the teacher, someone to be protected and provided for but never consulted as an equal. Our father, for all his love, had shared this fundamental blindness to my capabilities. Standing in the house where I'd grown up, surrounded by people who knew me only as the daughter who'd chosen education over enterprise, I realized that my moment had finally arrived. Not the moment I'd planned or anticipated, but the moment the universe had provided. Marcus wanted to inherit Harrison Manufacturing based on his gender and his degree, believing that these qualifications trumped any other considerations. He was about to discover that business success isn't about what you assume you deserve, but about what you actually control. The conversation that would change everything began the next morning, when Marcus called to inform me of his decision to take over the business. But before he could finish outlining his plans, I had questions of my own. "Marcus," I said, interrupting his monologue about client retention strategies, "have you reviewed the lease agreement for the building?" There was a pause. "What lease agreement?" "The one between Harrison Manufacturing and Mitchell Holdings. Dad's been renting the space for 3 years. I'm assuming you'll want to understand all the company's obligations before taking over." Another pause, longer this time. "I'm sure the lease terms are standard. Dad was good at negotiating those kinds of details." I smiled, though he couldn't see it through the phone. Oh yes, Dad was an excellent negotiator, but you should still review the agreement. Especially the succession clauses. Succession clauses? Marcus's confidence wavered slightly. What are you talking about? Property leases often include provisions about what happens when businesses change ownership, I explained, adopting the patient tone of a teacher explaining a concept to a struggling student. Just something to consider as you're planning the transition. The conversation ended with Marcus promising to look into the lease details, though his tone suggested he considered this a minor administrative matter rather than anything significant. I hung up the phone and allowed myself a moment of anticipation. The revelation was coming soon, and it was going to be spectacular. That afternoon, Marcus called back. His voice had changed completely. Sophie, we need to talk. Can you come to the office? Which office? I asked innocently, though I knew exactly what he meant. Harrison Manufacturing. There's something about this lease situation that doesn't make sense. I checked my watch. 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon. Perfect timing. I can be there in an hour. Should I meet you in the main office? The main office of Harrison Manufacturing was where my father had conducted business for 3 years. In the building I owned, paying rent to the company I'd created. Walking through those doors as Sophie Harrison, rather than as the anonymous landlord, was going to be one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But first, I had a call to make. Mitchell Holdings' property manager needed to know that the building's owner would be making a personal appearance at one of her properties. After all, it was important to maintain professional standards, even when family drama was involved. Especially when family drama was involved. As I prepared to leave my apartment for Harrison Manufacturing, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. Sophie Harrison, third-grade teacher, dressed in the practical clothes and comfortable shoes that were my daily uniform. But today, I wasn't just a teacher visiting her late father's business. I was a commercial property owner about to have a very important conversation with her tenant's successor. The drive to the industrial district took me through neighborhoods that had transformed dramatically since I'd first invested in the area. New restaurants, trendy lofts, art galleries, and coffee shops had sprouted along streets that were formerly lined with empty storefronts and abandoned lots. The urban renewal project had exceeded even my optimistic projections, and property values throughout the corridor had soared. As I pulled into the parking lot of Harrison Manufacturing, I felt a complex mix of emotions. This building represented my father's final chapter, the place where he'd spent his last productive years creating the metalwork that had built his reputation. But it also represented my first major investment, the foundation of everything I'd built since. In a few minutes, those two realities would collide in ways that would change my family forever. Marcus's car was already in the parking lot, along with several others I didn't recognize. Through the large windows of the main office, I could see him pacing while talking on his phone, his gestures animated in the way they always became when he was agitated. Whatever he'd discovered about the lease had clearly disrupted his confident assumption about inheriting the business smoothly. I sat in my car for a moment longer, appreciating the irony of the situation. For 3 years, I'd driven past this building regularly, sometimes stopping to admire the improvements I'd funded and the success of the business operating inside. But I'd never entered during business hours, never revealed my connection to the property. Today, that careful separation was about to end. My phone buzzed with a text from my property manager. Confirmed owner visit to Harrison Manufacturing property. All documentation ready if needed. Good luck. I smiled at her message. She was one of the few people who knew the full scope of my real estate holdings, and she'd been invaluable in maintaining the professional separation between Sophie Harrison and Mitchell Holdings. Her discretion had allowed me to build my empire in plain sight, hiding behind the anonymity of corporate structures while my family remained completely unaware. Taking a deep breath, I stepped out of my car and walked toward the entrance of Harrison Manufacturing. Through the glass doors, I could see the reception area where clients had met with my father for years, discussing custom fabrication projects and reviewing detailed specifications. The space was clean, professional, and efficient, exactly what I'd envisioned when I'd renovated the building. Marcus appeared in the reception area as I approached, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing concern. He opened the door before I could knock, his usual confident demeanor notably absent. "Sophie, thank God you're here. We have a serious problem." I stepped into the reception area of Harrison Manufacturing, a space I'd designed and renovated but had never officially entered during business hours. The familiar scent of metal polish and industrial cleaner filled the air, mixed with the coffee that someone had brewed too strong. Marcus stood near the reception desk, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, his tie loosened and his hair showing signs of repeated hand-running. "What kind of problem?" I asked, though I already knew exactly what had him so agitated. He gestured toward the back office where Dad used to handle the business side of operations. "The lease situation is completely screwed up. I've been on the phone with our lawyer for the past hour, and nothing makes sense." I followed him through the familiar hallway, past the fabrication floor where Dad's employees continued their work despite the uncertainty surrounding the business's future. The sound of welding and metal cutting provided a steady background rhythm, a reminder that regardless of ownership disputes, the actual work of the company continued. Dad's office looked exactly as it had the last time I'd seen it, which was never from this angle. The desk where he'd reviewed contracts and planned projects, the filing cabinets containing years of client records, the photographs on the walls showing completed installations that had made him proud. Marcus had clearly been going through paperwork, evidenced by the stacks of documents covering every available surface. "Look at this," Marcus said, shoving a folder toward me. "This lease agreement with Mitchell Holdings. I can't get anyone from their company on the phone. Their property management office gives me the runaround every time I call. And the terms," he shook his head in frustration, "the terms don't make any business sense." I opened the folder and reviewed the lease agreement I'd had my lawyers draft 3 years ago. The document was thorough, professional, and heavily weighted in favor of the tenant. Below market rent, extensive landlord responsibilities for maintenance and improvements, and flexible terms for business modifications. Any objective observer would agree that Harrison Manufacturing had secured an extraordinarily favorable deal. "What specifically doesn't make sense?" I asked, though I was genuinely curious to hear his perspective. "Everything," Marcus said, beginning to pace behind the desk. "Look at the rent. We're paying about 60% of market rate for this space. The landlord is responsible for all major maintenance, all building improvements, even stuff that directly benefits our operations. What kind of property owner agrees to those terms?" "Maybe one who values long-term tenants over short-term profits," I suggested. Marcus stopped pacing and stared at me. "Sophie, this is business, not charity. Nobody leaves that much money on the table unless they're getting something in return. And I can't figure out what Mitchell Holdings is getting out of this deal." I set the folder down and took a seat in one of the chairs facing Dad's desk. "Have you considered that maybe they're just good landlords? Some property owners prioritize tenant stability over maximum revenue." "No," Marcus said firmly. "That's not how commercial real estate works. I've got my MBA, remember? I understand market dynamics. This lease is either the result of some personal relationship Dad had with someone at Mitchell Holdings, or there's something else going on that I don't understand." The irony of Marcus explaining business principles to me, while standing in a building I owned, was almost overwhelming. I maintained my composed expression while internally savoring the moment. "What does our lawyer say?" "That's the other weird thing," Marcus continued, resuming his pacing. "Johnson reviewed the succession clauses, and they're unlike anything he's seen in a standard commercial lease. Normally, when a business changes ownership, the landlord has the right to review and approve the new tenant. Sometimes they can even terminate the lease if they don't like the successor." I nodded encouragingly. "That sounds reasonable from a landlord's perspective." "Right, but this lease doesn't have those standard protections. Instead, it has this bizarre clause that says, if the business ownership changes, the lease terms can be renegotiated at the landlord's discretion, but only if the landlord initiates the discussion. Otherwise, everything stays exactly the same." "And that's unusual?" Marcus turned to face me directly. "Sophie, it's like the lease was written specifically to protect Dad's interests, even after his death. Like someone wanted to make sure that whoever inherited the business would be locked into the same favorable terms indefinitely. Unless... He trailed off, his expression shifting as a new possibility occurred to him. Unless what? I prompted. Unless the landlord doesn't want the business to stay in the family, Marcus said slowly. Unless someone at Mitchell Holdings is planning to use Dad's death as an opportunity to force us out, maybe sell the building for redevelopment. I almost laughed at his paranoid interpretation, but managed to keep my expression neutral. That seems like a pretty elaborate scheme. Why would they wait 3 years and give Dad such favorable terms if they just wanted to get rid of him? I don't know, Marcus admitted. But something's not right here. I've been trying to research Mitchell Holdings, and they're incredibly secretive. Private company. No public information about ownership or other properties. Their lawyer won't return my calls. Their property manager claims she needs written authorization for any discussions about lease modifications. Written authorization from whom? The owner, Marcus said, but nobody will tell me who the owner actually is. It's like they're deliberately making this as difficult as possible. I stood up and moved to the window overlooking the fabrication floor. Dad's employees were working on what appeared to be a large architectural project, the kind of complex installation that had built Harrison Manufacturing's reputation for quality and precision. Maybe you should focus on running the business rather than worrying about lease negotiations. The terms seem favorable, so why create problems where none exist? Marcus's laugh held no humor. Because I can't run a business when I don't understand the foundation it's built on. What if Mitchell Holdings decides they want us out? What if they're planning some kind of development that requires demolishing this building? I need to know what we're dealing with. And what if you're overthinking this? I suggested. What if Mitchell Holdings is exactly what they appear to be? A property management company that values stable tenants and maintains their buildings well. Then why won't they talk to me? Marcus demanded. Why all the secrecy and legal barriers? Legitimate businesses don't operate like this. I turned back from the window to face him. They acknowledge that Harrison Manufacturing is a valued tenant. They express condolences for Dad's passing, but they won't discuss any substantive issues about the lease or their long-term plans. I picked up the lease agreement again, scanning through provisions I'd helped draft. Looking at this objectively, it seems like they're honoring their commitments. The rent is current, the building is well maintained, and they're not trying to change any terms. Maybe their silence is actually a good sign. Or maybe they're waiting for the right moment to drop a bomb on us, Marcus countered. Business doesn't work on assumptions, Sophie. I need facts, concrete information about what we're dealing with. What would you do if you could talk to the owner directly? Marcus's eyes lit up at the possibility. I'd find out what their intentions are for this property. I'd negotiate a longer-term lease with clear succession provisions. And I'd try to understand what Dad did to secure such favorable terms, so I could maintain that relationship going forward. And if their intentions don't align with your plans for Harrison Manufacturing, then I'd need to find alternative space, Marcus said grimly. But that would be incredibly disruptive. We've got specialized equipment here, established workflows, client relationships based on our location and capabilities. Moving the business would be expensive and risky. I set the lease agreement back on the desk. It sounds like you're borrowing trouble. The current arrangement seems to be working well for everyone involved. Working well for everyone except me, Marcus said. I can't run a business when I don't understand the fundamental terms of our most important contract. I need control over this situation. The word control hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that extended far beyond lease negotiations. Marcus needed control over the business, control over the building, control over the narrative of his inheritance. What he was about to discover was that control isn't something you inherit or assume. It's something you earn. And sometimes it's something that's been quietly held by people you've consistently underestimated. What do you want me to do? I asked. I'm not exactly qualified to help with complex business negotiations. Marcus paused his pacing again, this time considering my question seriously. Actually, maybe you could help in a way I hadn't considered. You're good with people, right? That's what teaching is about. Maybe you could try calling Mitchell Holdings, see if you get a different response. What would I say? I don't know anything about commercial real estate. Just try to get someone on the phone who can talk about the building ownership. Maybe they'll be more responsive to Dad's daughter than to his successor. Sometimes a personal touch works better than a business approach. I pretended to consider his suggestion. I could try, but I'm not sure what I'd accomplish that you haven't already tried. At this point, I'm willing to try anything, Marcus said. This mystery landlord situation is making me crazy. I need to know what we're dealing with before I can make any long-term plans for the business. All right, I agreed. I'll see what I can find out. But don't get your hopes up. If they won't talk to you, they probably won't talk to me either. Marcus's relief was visible. Thank you. I really appreciate this, Sophie. I know business stuff isn't your area, but having family support means a lot right now. I almost felt guilty about the deception, watching my brother struggle with a problem that I could solve instantly. But Marcus's patronizing attitude throughout our conversation, his casual assumptions about my capabilities, and his evident belief that I couldn't possibly understand the complexities he was facing, reminded me why this revelation needed to happen exactly as I'd planned it. I'll make some calls tomorrow, I promised. Give me the contact information for Mitchell Holdings, and I'll see what I can discover. Marcus handed me a business card from his wallet. This is their property management office. The woman I've been dealing with is named Janet Morrison. She's polite, but completely unhelpful. I looked at the card, recognizing Janet's information. She was excellent at her job, which included protecting the privacy of Mitchell Holdings' ownership structure. Janet knew exactly who owned the building, but she also knew that revealing that information without explicit authorization would violate her professional obligations. I'll call her first thing tomorrow morning, I said, slipping the card into my purse. Teacher's tone might work better than businessman's tone. God, I hope so, Marcus said. Because if we can't resolve this lease situation, it's going to create serious problems for taking over the business. I looked around Dad's office one more time, taking in the evidence of his years of hard work and dedication. Speaking of taking over the business, have you started making plans for the transition? Marcus's demeanor shifted back to confident business mode. I've got meetings scheduled with our major clients next week. I want to assure them that Harrison Manufacturing will continue operating at the same high standards under my leadership. The key is maintaining continuity while introducing some strategic improvements. What kind of improvements? Modernization, primarily, Marcus said, settling into Dad's chair behind the desk. We need updated equipment, streamlined processes, maybe some expansion into related markets. Dad was excellent at the craft side of the business, but he was old school about technology and marketing. I nodded, though internally I bristled at the implied criticism of our father's methods. And you think the business can support those kinds of investments? Absolutely. The profit margins are solid, the client base is loyal, and there's definite growth potential. With proper management and strategic vision, Harrison Manufacturing could become a much larger operation. Larger how? Marcus leaned forward, warming to his favorite subject. We could add additional product lines, maybe move into mass production for certain items instead of just custom work. We could expand our geographic reach, possibly open satellite locations in other cities. The fundamentals are strong, we just need more ambitious leadership. I listened to his expansion plans while wondering if he'd considered how his mysterious landlord might react to significantly increased industrial activity in the building. The current lease was written for Harrison Manufacturing's existing operations, not for the kind of major expansion Marcus was envisioning. That sounds like it would require significant capital investment, I observed. Some upfront costs, yes, but the return on investment would justify it. I've already started looking into equipment financing and potential investors for expansion capital. Investors? Business partners who could provide funding in exchange for equity stakes, Marcus explained, adopting the patient tone he always used when explaining business concepts to me. It's a standard way to finance growth when you need more capital than the business generates internally. I almost asked whether he'd discussed these investor plans with Mitchell Holdings, since major changes to the business might trigger lease renegotiation clauses, but I caught myself. That level of detailed questioning would seem suspiciously sophisticated coming from someone who supposedly knew nothing about commercial real estate or business operations. It sounds like you've got everything figured out, I said instead. The business strategy, yes, Marcus replied. The building situation is still a major unknown. That's why resolving the Mitchell Holdings mystery is so important. I can't make long-term plans when I don't understand our fundamental operating constraints. We spent another 30 minutes reviewing various aspects of Dad's business, from client relationships to employee contracts to equipment maintenance schedules. Throughout the conversation, Marcus maintained his role as the knowledgeable executive, explaining complex matters to his well-meaning but business-naive sister. He answered my questions with exaggerated patience, clearly pleased to demonstrate his expertise and leadership capabilities. What Marcus didn't realize was that I was conducting my own evaluation of his readiness to take over Harrison Manufacturing. His technical knowledge was solid, and his strategic thinking showed promise, but his dismissive attitude toward anything outside his immediate experience was problematic. More concerning was his assumption that business success could be achieved through force of will and superior credentials, without regard for relationships, context, or the perspectives of others. As we prepared to leave the office, Marcus returned to the subject of Mitchell Holdings one more time. Sophie, when you call them tomorrow, try to get a sense of whether they're planning any major changes to the building or the rental terms. I need to know if we're dealing with a stable situation or potential disruption. I'll do my best, I promised. But remember, I'm just a teacher. I might not understand the implications of whatever they tell me. That's okay, Marcus said, patting my shoulder in a gesture that managed to be both affectionate and condescending. Just get as much information as you can, and I'll figure out what it means for the business. We walked out of Harrison Manufacturing together, Marcus locking up while I stood in the parking lot looking up at the building I owned. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the industrial district, and I could see the evidence of ongoing development in every direction. New construction, renovated buildings, and improved infrastructure were transforming the area into exactly the kind of thriving commercial corridor I'd envisioned when I first invested here. Thanks for coming down here today, Marcus said as we reached our cars. I know this business stuff isn't really your thing, but having family support makes a big difference. Of course, I replied. We're in this together, right? Marcus smiled, apparently reassured by my sisterly solidarity. Exactly. And once we get this building situation sorted out, everything else should fall into place. Dad built something really solid here. I just need to take it to the next level. I drove home from Harrison Manufacturing with my mind racing. Tomorrow's phone call to Janet Morrison would begin the process of revealing my true relationship to the building and the business. But I wanted the revelation to unfold strategically, not just for maximum impact, but to ensure that Marcus understood the full scope of what he'd been assuming and overlooking. That evening, I reviewed all the documents related to my ownership of the building and my role in Mitchell Holdings. The paperwork was meticulous, legally sound, and designed to protect both my privacy and my business interests. When Marcus discovered the truth, there would be no ambiguity about my position as his landlord, no questions about the legitimacy of my ownership, and no doubt about the power dynamics he'd been misunderstanding. I also spent time considering what I wanted to achieve beyond simply shocking my brother with the revelation. This wasn't just about proving a point or getting revenge for years of condescension. The future of Harrison Manufacturing was at stake, along with the jobs of Dad's employees and the legacy of work he'd built over decades. Marcus's expansion plans weren't necessarily wrong, but they reflected his typical pattern of rushing toward ambitious goals without fully understanding the foundation he was building on. His assumption that he could solve the Mitchell Holdings mystery through persistence and superior business acumen was characteristic of his approach to most challenges. Apply more force, leverage more credentials, demand more respect. What Marcus had never learned was that some problems require finesse rather than force, understanding rather than assertion, and humility rather than confidence. Tomorrow's phone call would begin teaching him those lessons, whether he was ready to learn them or not. I called Janet Morrison's direct line at exactly 9 a.m. the next morning, using my personal phone rather than the secure line I normally used for Mitchell Holdings business. She answered on the second ring, her professional voice carrying the slight wariness that came from dealing with persistent inquiries about building ownership. Janet Morrison, Property Management. Ms. Morrison, this is Sophie Harrison. My brother Marcus has been trying to reach someone at Mitchell Holdings about our family's business lease. There was a brief pause. Ms. Harrison, I'm familiar with your brother's inquiries. I'm afraid I can't discuss lease details without proper authorization from the building owner. I understand, I said, maintaining the slightly uncertain tone of someone unfamiliar with commercial real estate procedures. I was just hoping to get some basic information about the building's future. My family is concerned about stability after my father's passing. I can assure you that Harrison Manufacturing is considered a valued tenant, Janet replied carefully. The building owner has no current plans that would disrupt your business operations. That's reassuring, I said, but my brother is worried about long-term security. Is there any way we could speak directly with the owner about our concerns? Another pause, longer this time. Janet knew exactly who the building owner was, and she was probably wondering why I was calling instead of simply revealing my identity to Marcus. The owner prefers to maintain privacy and handle all communications through our office. However, if there are specific concerns about the lease or building operations, I'd be happy to convey them. Actually, I said, making my voice sound as if I just had an idea, would it be possible for the owner to meet with us in person? I think my brother would feel much more comfortable if he could discuss the situation face-to-face with whoever makes the decisions about this property. I can certainly make that request, Janet said slowly, though I should mention that the owner rarely agrees to direct meetings with tenants. I understand it's unusual, I said, but this is a family business, and we're dealing with a difficult transition. Maybe if you explain that we're not looking to change anything, just seeking reassurance about stability. I'll pass along your request, Janet promised. Should I contact you or your brother with the response? You can call me, I said. I'm probably easier to reach during the day than Marcus is. After hanging up, I sat back in my apartment's kitchen chair and smiled. Phase 1 was complete. Janet would dutifully relay my request to the building owner, which meant she'd be calling me back on my secure line within the hour to discuss how to handle this delicate situation. My secure phone rang 47 minutes later. This is certainly an interesting development, Janet said without preamble. Are you planning to reveal your ownership to your brother? I think it's time, I replied, but I want to do it in a way that maximizes the learning experience for Marcus. He's been assuming a lot of things about business, about me, and about what he's entitled to inherit. This seems like the perfect opportunity for some education. How do you want to handle the meeting? I considered the options. Schedule it for Friday afternoon at the Harrison Manufacturing offices. Tell Marcus that the building owner has agreed to meet with him and his sister to discuss the business's future. Don't give him any other details. And during the meeting, let him make his presentation first. I want to hear what he thinks he deserves, what he believes he can demand from his landlord, and how he plans to negotiate from a position that he thinks is strength. Janet chuckled. This should be educational for everyone involved. Janet, I said, make sure you're there too. I want this to be completely professional, properly documented, and legally clear. When Marcus realizes what's happened, he's going to question everything. I don't want there to be any ambiguity about my position or my rights as property owner. Understood. I'll bring all the relevant documentation and have our attorney available by phone if needed. After ending the call, I spent the rest of the day preparing for Friday's revelation. I reviewed every aspect of my ownership of the building, every clause in Harrison Manufacturing's lease, and every legal protection I'd built into the Mitchell Holdings structure. When Marcus discovered the truth, he was going to be shocked, angry, and probably desperate to find some way to challenge my position. I wanted to be absolutely certain that no such challenge was possible. I also thought carefully about what I wanted to happen after the revelation. This wasn't just about demonstrating my brother's misconceptions. It was about determining the best path forward for Dad's business, for the employees who depended on it, and for the family relationships that would inevitably be changed by this disclosure. Thursday evening, Marcus called to tell me about the scheduled meeting. I got a call from Janet Morrison today, he said, his excitement barely contained. The owner of Mitchell Holdings has agreed to meet with us tomorrow afternoon. This is exactly the breakthrough we needed. That's wonderful, I said. What did she tell you about the owner? Not much, just that they're willing to discuss the building's future and our concerns about lease stability. But the fact that they're agreeing to a face-to-face meeting is huge, Sophie. It means they're serious about maintaining good tenant relationships. Or it means they have something important to tell us, I suggested. Either way, this is our chance to get answers and establish a direct relationship. I've been preparing talking points all afternoon. I was curious about his preparation. What kind of talking points? Business continuity assurances, potential expansion plans, long-term lease security. I want them to understand that Harrison Manufacturing is a stable, growing company that would be a valuable long-term tenant. And what if they have different ideas about the building's future? Marcus's confidence was unshakable. Then we'll negotiate. That's what business is about, finding mutually beneficial solutions. I've got leverage too, you know. We're established tenants with a track record of reliable payments and property care. They'd be crazy to force us out. I almost asked what leverage he thought he had beyond his self-assessed value as a tenant, but decided to save that conversation for tomorrow. Should I prepare anything for the meeting? Just be yourself, Marcus said. Let me handle the business discussion, but your presence will help demonstrate that this is a family company with strong roots in the community. Sometimes that personal touch makes a difference in negotiations. Friday afternoon arrived with unusually beautiful weather for the season. I dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing professional attire that would be appropriate for both my role as grieving sister and my role as commercial property owner. The irony of dressing up to meet with myself wasn't lost on me, but appearances mattered in business, and I wanted this revelation to be handled with complete professionalism. I arrived at Harrison Manufacturing 15 minutes early, parking next to Marcus's car in the lot of the building I owned. Janet Morrison's car was already there, along with another vehicle I didn't recognize. Through the office windows, I could see several people moving around inside, apparently setting up for our meeting. Marcus met me at the entrance, his nervous energy barely controlled. They're here already, he said. The owner and some kind of assistant or lawyer. This is really happening, Sophie. Are you ready? I've been ready for this conversation since Dad died, Marcus replied. This is exactly what I needed to start moving forward with confidence. We walked into the reception area together, where Janet Morrison stood waiting with a professionally dressed man I recognized as David Chen, the attorney who'd helped me structure Mitchell Holdings and draft the original lease agreement. A briefcase sat on the reception desk, along with several folders of documents. Mr. Morrison, Ms. Harrison, Janet said formally, thank you for making time for this meeting. I'd like you to meet David Chen, legal counsel for Mitchell Holdings. Marcus stepped forward confidently to shake hands with both Janet and David. Thank you both for coming. We really appreciate the opportunity to discuss our situation directly with the building owner. About that, Janet said carefully, there's something you should understand before we begin formal discussions. Marcus looked between Janet and David, his confidence wavering slightly. What do you mean? David Chen opened his briefcase and removed a folder of documents. Mr. Morrison, the building owner is indeed present for this meeting. In fact, she's been here the entire time. Marcus's confusion was visible. I don't understand. Where is she? Janet Morrison looked directly at me. Mr. Morrison, I'd like you to meet the sole owner of this building and the principal of Mitchell Holdings, your sister, Sophie Harrison. The silence that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Marcus's face went through a sequence of expressions: confusion, disbelief, shock, and finally a dawning comprehension that changed his entire understanding of the previous 3 years. He looked from Janet to David to me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. That's impossible, he finally managed. Sophie's a teacher. She doesn't own buildings. I'm both, I said quietly. I teach 3rd grade at Riverside Elementary, and I own this building, along with several other commercial properties throughout the city. Marcus sank into one of the reception chairs, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. This is some kind of joke, right? You're joking. I'm not joking, I said, accepting the folder of documents David handed me. I purchased this building 3 years ago, renovated it, and leased it to Harrison Manufacturing through my company, Mitchell Holdings. You've been paying rent to me for 3 years, Marcus. But that's... Marcus struggled to process the information. You're a teacher. You live in a tiny apartment. You drive a 10-year-old car. How could you possibly afford to buy a building? The same way Dad built Harrison Manufacturing, I replied. Through careful planning, strategic investments, and hard work. The difference is that I chose to keep my business activities private. Marcus stood up abruptly, beginning to pace in the small reception area. This doesn't make sense. If you owned the building, why didn't you tell Dad? Why all the secrecy and corporate structures? Because I wanted to ensure that Harrison Manufacturing succeeded on its own merits, I explained. Dad needed quality space at a fair price, and I needed a reliable tenant for my first major property investment. The arrangement worked well for everyone. But the lease terms, Marcus said, his business training reasserting itself. You gave Dad incredibly favorable rates. You left money on the table. I prioritized long-term stability over short-term profits, I said. That's a legitimate business strategy, even if it's not the one you would have chosen. David Chen stepped forward with his professional demeanor intact. Mr. Morrison, if you'd like to review the ownership documentation, I have copies of all relevant legal filings. Your sister's ownership of this property is completely legitimate and properly recorded. Marcus accepted the documents but didn't look at them immediately. Instead, he stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of shock, anger, and something that might have been respect. How long have you been planning this? He asked. Planning what? This revelation. This moment. How long have you known that you'd eventually tell me you own Dad's building? I considered his question carefully. I've been prepared for this conversation since the day I bought the property. I knew that eventually circumstances would require me to reveal my ownership. Dad's death simply provided the timing. And you've just been sitting there listening to me worry about lease negotiations and landlord relationships, knowing the whole time that you controlled everything? I've been listening to you make assumptions, I corrected. About me, about business, about what you're entitled to inherit. This seemed like an appropriate time to address those assumptions. Marcus finally looked down at the ownership documents, scanning through them with the focused attention of someone whose entire worldview was shifting. These are real. You actually own this building. I actually own this building, I confirmed. And Mitchell Holdings is your company. Mitchell Holdings is my company. Marcus set the documents on the reception desk and looked around the space as if seeing it for the first time. Dad never knew. Dad never knew, I agreed. He believed he was dealing with an anonymous investment company that happened to offer favorable lease terms. Why? Marcus asked. Why keep it secret from him? I moved to the window overlooking the fabrication floor, where Dad's employees continued their work unaware of the drama unfolding in the front office. Because Dad had very specific ideas about what his daughter should and shouldn't do with her life. Revealing that I owned his building would have complicated our relationship in ways that wouldn't have benefited anyone. And now Dad is gone, and you're making plans for the future based on incomplete information. It seemed like time to provide clarity. Marcus joined me at the window, both of us looking out at the business our father had built. What does this mean for Harrison Manufacturing? That depends largely on your plans and priorities, I said. The current lease remains in effect, with all its existing terms and provisions. But any major changes to the business operations would need to be discussed with the property owner. Which is you. Which is me. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, apparently processing the full implications of this revelation. When he finally spoke, his voice held a different quality, more thoughtful, less assured than I'd heard from him in years. You've been supporting Dad's business this entire time. Indirectly, but still supporting it. I've been providing fair value in exchange for reliable rent payments, I said. But yes, I suppose I've been supporting the business. And me, Marcus said slowly. You've been supporting me too, in a way. My plans for taking over Harrison Manufacturing were built on the assumption that we had a stable, long-term lease. Without that foundation, your inheritance would be much more complicated, I agreed. Marcus turned away from the window to face me directly. What do you want, Sophie? What's your endgame here? It was the question I'd been expecting, and the one that would determine everything that happened next. The question hung in the air between us, heavy with implications that extended far beyond simple business negotiations. Marcus stood waiting for my answer, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty, as he grappled with the reality that his little sister held all the cards he'd assumed were his to play. What I want, I said carefully, is to ensure that Dad's legacy continues in the hands of someone who truly understands its value. Not just its financial worth, but its meaning to the community, to the employees, and to the standards he spent 30 years building. Marcus's expression tightened. And you don't think I understand that? I think you understand the business metrics, I replied. But I'm not sure you understand the person behind them. Dad didn't build Harrison Manufacturing just to create wealth or establish market dominance. He built it to solve problems, to create beautiful things, and to provide good jobs for skilled craftspeople. That's exactly what I want to continue, Marcus protested. With improvements and expansion that would honor his memory while building something even greater. I moved away from the window and back toward the center of the reception area, where Janet and David waited with professional patience while family dynamics played out in front of them. Tell me about your expansion plans, Marcus. The investor discussions you mentioned, the additional product lines, the satellite locations. Marcus straightened, clearly relieved to return to familiar territory. The core business is solid, but we're operating at a fraction of our potential. With proper capital investment, we could triple our production capacity, expand into mass manufacturing for architectural firms, maybe even develop our own line of prefabricated components. And the investors? A private equity group that specializes in small manufacturing companies. They've reviewed our financials and see significant growth potential. With their backing, we could modernize equipment, hire additional staff, and capture market share from larger competitors who can't match our quality standards. I listened to his presentation while mentally calculating the implications for the building, the current employees, and the fundamental character of the business. What percentage of the company would these investors want? Initially 40% for a $2 million capital injection, with performance milestones that could increase their stake to 60% over 5 years. So you'd be giving up majority control of Dad's company to outside investors? Marcus's enthusiasm faltered slightly. That's standard for growth capital investments. They need sufficient ownership to protect their interests and ensure proper business management. And if their vision for the company conflicts with yours, we'd work together to find solutions that benefit everyone, Marcus said, though his tone suggested he hadn't deeply considered this possibility. I walked over to the reception desk where David Chen had arranged his documents. Marcus, these investors you're talking to, have they expressed any opinions about the building lease situation? They see it as a positive, Marcus replied quickly. Below market rent reduces our operating costs and improves profit margins. They assume we can maintain favorable terms going forward. They assume, I repeated. But they haven't actually verified that assumption with the property owner. Marcus's confidence wavered again. Well, no, but given our track record as tenants and the relationship Dad built with Mitchell Holdings, there's no reason to think. There's no reason to think what? I prompted. That any reasonable landlord would disrupt a successful business relationship. I smiled slightly at his choice of words. Define reasonable, Marcus. He looked confused by the question. Someone who prioritizes long-term stability over short-term gains. Someone who understands that good tenants are valuable assets. And if the landlord has different priorities, if they value other things more than maximum rental income or even tenant stability, then we'd negotiate, Marcus said, his frustration beginning to show. Sophie, where are you going with this? We've established that you own the building. Are you planning to disrupt the lease? Are you going to force Harrison Manufacturing out? I'm not planning to force anyone out, I said. But I am planning to ensure that any future arrangements serve the best interests of everyone involved, including Dad's employees, his clients, and his reputation. Marcus glanced at Janet and David, apparently seeking support or at least neutral witnesses to what he clearly saw as an unreasonable position. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that your expansion plans would fundamentally change the nature of Harrison Manufacturing, mass production, private equity ownership, satellite locations. These aren't improvements to Dad's vision, they're replacements for it. They're business growth strategies. Marcus countered. Dad would have wanted the company to succeed and grow. Dad would have wanted the company to maintain its integrity while growing, I corrected. There's a difference between expansion and transformation. Marcus began pacing again, his agitation clear. You can't seriously be suggesting that I shouldn't pursue growth opportunities because they don't match some idealized version of what Dad might have wanted? I'm suggesting that you consider what you'd be giving up in exchange for those opportunities. Such as? I gestured toward the fabrication floor visible through the office windows. Control over quality standards. Decision-making authority about which projects to accept. The ability to maintain long-term relationships with employees and clients. The flexibility to prioritize craftsmanship over efficiency when the situation demands it. Private equity partnerships don't eliminate those capabilities, Marcus argued. They provide resources to enhance them. In exchange for 40 to 60% ownership of the company, I reminded him. Which means 40 to 60% control over those decisions. Marcus stopped pacing and faced me directly. Okay, let's cut to the point, Sophie. Are you planning to use your ownership of this building to block my business plans? The question was fair, and it deserved a direct answer. I'm planning to use my ownership of this building to ensure that any changes to Harrison Manufacturing serve its long-term interests. If your private equity plans accomplish that, then I'll support them. If they don't, then we'll need to discuss alternatives. Alternatives such as? I looked at Janet, who nodded slightly, confirming that she had the documents I'd requested. Such as a family partnership that preserves Dad's vision while providing capital for sustainable growth. Marcus's eyes narrowed. What kind of family partnership? The kind where Harrison Manufacturing remains family-owned and family-controlled, but benefits from capital investment that doesn't require surrendering majority ownership to outside investors. And where would this capital investment come from? I accepted a folder from Janet and handed it to Marcus. From Mitchell Holdings. From me. Marcus opened the folder and scanned the documents inside. A business proposal, financial projections, and a detailed investment plan that I'd been developing since Dad's death. His expression changed as he absorbed the scope and sophistication of what I was presenting. You want to buy into Harrison Manufacturing? I want to ensure its continued success while preserving its essential character, I said. The investment proposal outlines how that could be accomplished. Marcus read through the documents more carefully, his business training evident in how he analyzed the numbers and terms. These financial projections show steady growth without the aggressive expansion timeline I was planning. They show sustainable growth that doesn't require fundamental changes to the business model or workforce. And this equipment modernization schedule, it's much more gradual than what the private equity group proposed. It prioritizes quality improvements over capacity increases, I explained. New equipment that helps existing employees do better work, rather than equipment that replaces human skills with automated processes. Marcus continued reading, occasionally asking clarifying questions about specific provisions or financial assumptions. After 20 minutes of detailed review, he set the documents on the reception desk and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, thoughtful respect, mixed with lingering uncertainty. This is incredibly detailed, Sophie. When did you put this together? I've been working on various scenarios since Dad started talking about succession planning, I admitted. I wanted to be prepared for different possibilities, including the possibility that I'd pursue outside investors, including the possibility that you'd need alternatives to outside investors. Marcus was quiet for several minutes, apparently weighing his options against this unexpected development. When he finally spoke, his tone was more measured than it had been all afternoon. Your proposal would give you what percentage of the company? 30% initially, with the option to increase to 40% based on performance milestones, I said. You'd retain majority ownership and operational control, but with a partner who understands both the business and the building it operates in. And the lease situation? would be resolved in a way that serves the company's long-term interests. Favorable terms for sustainable operations, with provisions for modifications if needed to support agreed-upon growth plans. Marcus picked up the proposal again, this time focusing on the partnership structure and governance provisions. This gives you significant input into major business decisions. It gives me input proportional to my investment, I corrected. And it ensures that decisions are made collaboratively rather than unilaterally. Even if I disagree with your perspective? Especially if you disagree with my perspective, I said. Good business decisions benefit from multiple viewpoints and healthy debate. Marcus set the documents down and walked back to the window overlooking the fabrication floor. I need to understand something, Sophie. Are you doing this because you don't trust me to run the business properly? The question cut to the heart of our family dynamics and the assumptions that had shaped our relationship for years. I considered my answer carefully, knowing that how I responded would determine whether we could move forward as partners, or would remain locked in the adversarial positions that had brought us to this moment. I'm doing this because I love Dad's legacy and want to see it continued by someone who has both the skills and the support to succeed, I said finally. You have excellent business instincts, Marcus, but you also have blind spots. Just like I do. Partnership helps address those blind spots. What blind spots do you think I have? You tend to assume that bigger is always better, that growth is always positive, and that your perspective is always complete, I said. Those aren't character flaws, but they can lead to strategic mistakes. Marcus turned back to face me. And what blind spots do you think you have? I tend to be overly cautious, to prioritize stability over opportunity, and to underestimate my own capabilities, I admitted. Which is why I think we'd work well together. Your vision plus my resources. Your ambition plus my foundation. David Chen cleared his throat gently, reminding us that we had professional witnesses to this family negotiation. If I may suggest, this decision doesn't need to be made immediately. Mr. Morrison might want to review the proposal thoroughly, perhaps consult with his attorney, before committing to any specific path forward. Marcus nodded appreciatively at David's intervention. You're right. This is a major decision that affects the entire future of the company. I need time to think through all the implications. Of course, I agreed, but I should mention that timing is somewhat important. The private equity group you've been talking to will want an answer soon, and delaying that decision indefinitely could cost you that opportunity. How soon do you need a response? I looked at Janet, who consulted her calendar. Given the complexity of the legal and financial arrangements involved, if you're interested in pursuing this partnership, we'd need a preliminary agreement within 2 weeks to allow sufficient time for due diligence and documentation. Marcus absorbed this timeline with the focused attention of someone accustomed to business deadlines. 2 weeks to decide between private equity partnership and family partnership. 2 weeks to decide what kind of future you want for Harrison Manufacturing, I corrected. And if I choose the private equity route? Then you'll need to negotiate new lease terms with Mitchell Holdings based on your expanded operations and changed ownership structure, I said. I'd honor our existing agreement through its current term, but any significant modifications to the business would require renegotiation. At market rates? At rates that reflect the actual costs and risks of your proposed changes, I said. Including increased insurance requirements, additional infrastructure needs, and the impact on the building's other potential uses. Marcus's expression showed that he understood the implications. Moving from his current favorable lease terms to market-rate commercial rent would significantly impact the financial projections he'd presented to potential investors. So my choice is really between partnership with you or potentially losing the building entirely. Your choice is between different paths forward, each with their own advantages and constraints, I said. I'm not trying to force you into any particular decision, but I am ensuring that you make that decision with complete information about your situation. Marcus gathered the partnership proposal documents and slipped them into his briefcase. I need to review this thoroughly and probably get some independent advice before I can give you an answer. That's exactly what you should do, I agreed. This is too important a decision to make without careful consideration. Janet Morrison stepped forward with her professional demeanor intact. Mr. Morrison, If you have questions about the building ownership or lease provisions as you're making your decision, please don't hesitate to contact our office. We want to ensure you have all the information you need. Thank you, Marcus said, shaking hands with both Janet and David. I appreciate your patience with what I'm sure seemed like a very strange situation from your perspective. David Chen smiled slightly. Family business dynamics are often complex. The important thing is ensuring that all parties understand their positions and options. As Janet and David packed up their materials and prepared to leave, I found myself alone with Marcus in the reception area of Harrison Manufacturing. The building felt different now that all secrets had been revealed, as if the physical space itself had been transformed by the shift in our understanding. Sophie, Marcus said quietly, I need to ask you something, and I want a completely honest answer. Okay, how long have you been planning this? Not just the partnership proposal, but this whole revelation. The timing, the way you let me struggle with the Mitchell Holdings mystery, the way you've positioned yourself to have all the leverage in this situation. I considered his question, recognizing that my answer would affect his trust in any future partnership we might develop. I've been prepared for this conversation since I bought the building, but I wasn't actively planning to force it. Your assumptions about inheriting the business without any complications created the situation that made this revelation necessary. My assumptions? That you were entitled to take over Dad's company without considering anyone else's interests or capabilities. That the building lease was just another business detail you could handle when convenient. That I was just the supportive little sister who'd step aside while you made all the important decisions. Marcus flinched slightly at this characterization, but he didn't deny its accuracy. I never meant to dismiss your capabilities or interests. You didn't mean to, but you did, I said. Just like you never meant to assume that business success comes from credentials and confidence, rather than understanding and relationships. And now you're in a position to teach me those lessons whether I want to learn them or not. Now I'm in a position to offer you a choice, I corrected. You can continue pursuing your original plans with full knowledge of what they'll cost and what they'll require. Or you can consider a different approach that might achieve your goals while preserving what made Dad's business special. Marcus looked around the reception area one more time, his gaze taking in details he'd probably never noticed before. The quality of the renovation work, the thoughtful design choices, the evidence of investment and care that had transformed this space into something worthy of Harrison Manufacturing's reputation. You did beautiful work on this building, he said finally. Thank you. I wanted it to be worthy of the business it housed, even though Dad never knew you were responsible for it. Especially because Dad never knew. It had to succeed on its own merits, not because of family connections. Marcus nodded slowly, apparently beginning to understand the principles that had guided my approach to business and family relationships. Can I ask you one more thing? Of course. If you'd revealed your ownership of the building years ago, how do you think Dad would have reacted? I'd thought about this question many times, imagining various scenarios and conversations that had never occurred. I think he would have been proud of my success, but worried about the complications it created. Dad liked clear boundaries between family and business. Mixing the two would have made him uncomfortable. And now? Now those boundaries don't exist anymore, for better or worse. We have to figure out how to move forward with full knowledge of who we really are and what we're actually capable of. Marcus extended his hand to me, not in the patronizing gesture of an older brother tolerating his little sister's involvement, but in the respectful acknowledgement of an equal. I'll review your proposal carefully, Sophie. Whatever I decide, I want you to know that I finally understand what I've been missing about you all these years. I shook his hand, feeling the weight of changed relationships and new possibilities. And I want you to know that whatever you decide, I respect your right to make that choice. This was never about forcing you down a particular path, just about ensuring you understood all the paths that were available. As Marcus gathered his materials and prepared to leave, I remained in the reception area of the building I owned, thinking about the conversation that had just concluded and the decisions that lay ahead. Whether Marcus chose partnership with me or continued pursuing private equity investment, the fundamental dynamics of our family and business relationships had been permanently altered. The phone on the reception desk rang, interrupting my reflections. I answered it automatically, forgetting for a moment that I was in Harrison Manufacturing rather than Mitchell Holdings. Harrison Manufacturing, this is Sophie. Miss Harrison? The voice was unfamiliar, professional, with a slight confusion that suggested the caller hadn't expected a woman to answer. I was trying to reach Marcus Morrison about the private equity discussion we've been having. I recognized the significance of the call immediately. Mr. Morrison isn't available right now, but I can take a message. This is his business partner. Business partner? The caller's surprise was evident. I wasn't aware that Mr. Morrison had brought in a partner. This could complicate our investment discussions considerably. How so? Well, our due diligence was based on sole ownership of the company. If there's already a business partner involved, we'd need to restructure our entire proposal. I smiled at the irony of this unexpected development. I understand completely. Perhaps you should schedule another meeting with Mr. Morrison to discuss how recent changes affect your investment plans. Yes, that would be necessary. Can you have him call me as soon as possible? This is Richard Sullivan from Meridian Capital Partners. I'll make sure he gets the message, Mr. Sullivan. After hanging up, I realized that Marcus's private equity timeline had just become much more compressed. The investors had assumed they were dealing with a straightforward acquisition of a family business owned by a single heir. The revelation that a business partner was already involved would require them to reconsider their entire approach, possibly withdrawing their offer entirely if they couldn't accommodate the changed circumstances. This development didn't force Marcus toward my partnership proposal, but it did eliminate some of the pressure he might have felt to make a quick decision in favor of private equity investment. Whatever choice he made now would be based on the actual merits of each option rather than artificial time constraints. I spent another hour in Dad's former office, reviewing his files and understanding more deeply the business he'd built over 3 decades. The client relationships, the reputation for quality, the loyalty of employees who'd worked here for years, all represented value that couldn't be easily quantified on financial statements, but was nonetheless real and important. When I finally left Harrison Manufacturing that evening, I drove through the industrial district with a new perspective on the transformation that had occurred over the past 3 years. The area had indeed become the thriving commercial corridor I'd envisioned when I first invested here, but it had also maintained the character and functionality that made it valuable for businesses like my father's. That balance between progress and preservation was exactly what I hoped to achieve with Harrison Manufacturing itself. Growth that built on existing strengths rather than replacing them, success that honored the past while embracing the future, and family relationships that acknowledged both individual capabilities and collective responsibilities. 10 days later, Marcus called to schedule another meeting. His voice carried a different quality than I'd heard since Dad's death, more thoughtful, less presumptuous, with the measured tone of someone who'd carefully considered complex options. I've reviewed your proposal thoroughly, he said. I've also spoken with several attorneys and business advisors about the implications of family partnership versus private equity investment. And what did you conclude? That I've been thinking about this business transition in entirely the wrong terms, Marcus admitted. I was so focused on what I thought I deserved to inherit that I lost sight of what would actually serve the business best. We met again at Harrison Manufacturing, but this time the dynamic was completely different. Marcus had prepared questions that demonstrated deep understanding of both my proposal and the broader strategic issues facing the company. He'd clearly spent considerable time thinking about Dad's legacy and how best to continue it. The private equity group withdrew their offer, Marcus told me as we settled into Dad's former office. When they learned about the building ownership situation and the potential for a family partnership, they decided the investment was more complicated than they wanted to handle. I'm sorry if that created problems for your planning. Actually, it clarified things considerably, Marcus said. Their withdrawal made me realize how much control I would have been giving up for capital that I might not actually need. I waited for him to continue, recognizing that he needed to work through his reasoning aloud. Your partnership proposal provides sufficient capital for sustainable growth without requiring fundamental changes to the business model, Marcus continued. It preserves family ownership while bringing in expertise I need in areas where I have limited experience. Such as? Property management, obviously, but also long-term strategic planning and relationship management. You've demonstrated capabilities I didn't know existed, and frankly, skills that complement my own strengths, rather than competing with them. I felt a surge of hope that we might actually be able to work together effectively, but I maintained my neutral expression while Marcus finished his analysis. Most importantly, he said, your approach preserves what made Dad's business special while providing a foundation for growth that honors his memory and serves his employees. So you're accepting the partnership proposal? Marcus smiled for the first time since Dad's death, a genuine expression of relief and anticipation. I'm accepting the partnership proposal, with a few modifications that I think will serve both our interests. Over the next 2 hours, we worked through the details of a collaboration that neither of us had anticipated, but both of us now recognized as the best path forward. Marcus would retain operational control of Harrison Manufacturing, while I provided capital investment and strategic oversight. The building lease would be restructured to support the company's long-term needs, while protecting my interests as property owner. Most importantly, we established decision-making processes that required consultation and consensus on major issues, ensuring that neither of us could unilaterally impose our vision on the business. As we shook hands on our agreement, I realized that Dad's death had ultimately created something he'd never achieved during his lifetime. A true partnership between his children that leveraged both our strengths and addressed both our limitations. 6 months later, Harrison Manufacturing was thriving under our joint leadership. Marcus's business acumen and my financial resources had indeed proven complementary, allowing us to modernize equipment, expand our client base, and improve working conditions without sacrificing the quality standards that had built Dad's reputation. The industrial district continued its transformation, with Mitchell Holdings expanding its portfolio to include several additional properties that housed businesses similar to Harrison Manufacturing. My dual career as teacher and property developer had evolved into something more integrated, with my understanding of education and development informing both roles. Marcus had learned to value consultation and collaboration, while I had learned to assert my opinions and capabilities more directly. Our family dinners had evolved from Marcus lecturing about business, while I listened politely to genuine discussions about strategy, challenges, and opportunities. The most satisfying aspect of our partnership wasn't the financial success, though that was considerable, but the recognition that family relationships could evolve and improve when built on mutual respect, rather than traditional assumptions. Marcus had finally seen me as I actually was, and I had finally allowed him to see me. Standing in the reception area of Harrison Manufacturing on a busy Thursday afternoon, watching employees complete a complex architectural installation that would be featured in a national design magazine, I reflected on how dramatically our lives had changed since the morning Marcus had called to inform me of his inheritance plans. He'd learned that business success requires understanding and respecting all the factors that contribute to that success, including those that aren't immediately obvious. I'd learned that keeping capabilities hidden, while sometimes strategically necessary, ultimately serves no one's interests if it prevents authentic relationships and optimal outcomes. Dad would have been proud of what we'd built together, not just the financial performance of the business, but the family partnership that had emerged from crisis and revelation. His legacy lived on not just in the metalwork that carried the Harrison Manufacturing name, but in the collaboration between his children that honored both his memory and our own individual strengths. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.